Thank you for joining us for this webinar on ISO 45001-2018. Well, it's certainly been a long time coming, but the world's long-awaited and much anticipated international standard for occupational health and safety has finally been published this year. Set to transform workplace practices globally, ISO 45001 provides a robust and effective set of processes for improving safety at work across the world. More than 70 countries were directly involved in the creation of the standard, which is designed to help organisations of all sizes and industries to improve their health and safety standards. And that's by means of an easy-to-use framework that the standard provides. And ideally, the new international standard is expected to reduce the workplace injuries and illnesses around the world that we see unfortunately, practically on a daily basis. And Paul Robinson's going to explain a bit more about that shortly. And now, the other great news is that if you're already certified to ISO 9001, the quality standard, or ISO 14001, the environmental standard, you'll already have the framework in place really for implementing ISO 45001. As an expert in British and international standards, not only in health and safety, but also in quality and sustainability management, I'd like to introduce Paul Robinson. So Paul Robinson is Managing Consultant at Blackmores, and he's not only going to provide you with an overview of ISO 45001 during this webinar, but he's also going to give you advice on successfully implementing the standard. And if you're already certified to OHSAS 18001, he'll be providing you with tips on migration to the new standard. Now, during the webinar, if you have any questions, there is a feature online to be able to send those questions over to us. So hopefully we'll have some time at the end of the webinar, as this is a 45-minute session. When we timed it previously, it's about 35 minutes or so for the presentation to 40 minutes. We'll have some time for some questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Paul Robinson.
Thank you, Mel. Today we're going to talk about Introduction to ISO 45001. This relates to whether you're implementing the standard for the first time, whether you're looking to integrate the standard with your existing ISO standards, or whether you're looking to migrate from OHSAS 18001 across to the ISO 45001 standard. I'm going to be providing you with hints and tips, and specifically the success factors required to successfully implement the standard. This should hopefully position you for future success. Before we do that, I'd like to focus on some of the statistics that are related to health and safety from across the world. One worker dies every 15 seconds. That happen at work all over the world every year. In the time it's taken me to read that, another person has died at work. So this provides some context as to why an international standard for health and safety is required. But even at the UK level, the statistics are quite startling. In 2016-17, 137 people went to work and failed to return. This, coupled with injuries, stress, long-term sickness and disease, costs the UK business billions every year. And from a legal perspective, there's been a sharp increase in fines levied for health and safety related issues. A conviction in 2016-17 was secured in 554 of the 593 cases that were brought to court. This is a success rate of 93%, which shows that the health and safety executive are extremely good and efficient at doing their job. Of this, the duty holders found guilty paid an average penalty of around £100. Coupled with this, the use of immediate and custodial sentences has rapidly increased in 2016-17. So of those 93% successful cases, 6% of those cases resulted in somebody going to prison. So, why implement 45,001? Well, at a very simplistic level, it demonstrates a clear commitment to your workers. Your workers are your most prized assets, so ultimately you want to protect them from injury and ill health. Implementing 45,001 also helps to improve your safety culture, from evolving your organisation's culture from a reactive to a preventative and positive safety culture. Early migration from OHSAS 18001 is also a marketable benefit to your company. You can demonstrate that you're leading by example and standing out as a pioneer for best practice in occupational health and safety. And also, as Mel alluded to earlier, 45,001 is now easier to integrate with your other management system standards. So if you have 9001 and 14,001 2015 in place already, the high-level clause structure easily integrates with other standards. Those of you who are familiar with quality, environmental standards, and OHSAS 18001 will probably recognise this diagram. It's based on the plan, do, check, act cycle. So we start with planning. This moves us into support and operational controls, then into checking that our performance evaluation is effective. Finally, improvement. This is all supported by leadership and also worker participation, which is a distinct change from 9001 and 14,001 requirements. The Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle is broken down into a number of clauses. And again, those of you familiar with 9001 and environmental management systems will be familiar with this clause structure. Clauses 1 to 3 cover scope, normative reference, and terms and definitions. This is all useful information and should be considered and read before implementing the standard. The auditable element of the standard then starts at clause 4 with context. That leads us into leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and finally improvement. Note again the inclusion of worker participation in clause 5. This has been moved now into leadership. Clauses can be further broken down into the specific requirements that 45,001 requires us to implement. Again, notice under clause 5 the addition of clause 5.4, the requirement to consult and participate with workers. For those of you who have 9001 management systems in place or 14,001 management systems in place, you'll notice that this is a brand new clause and doesn't appear in other management system standards. So, to focus on some of the specific clauses in 45,001. For those of you who are familiar with 9001 2015 or 14,001 2015, you'll be familiar with this new clause, context of the organisation. But for those of you who have 18,000 and also understanding the needs and expectations of workers and other interested parties. As mentioned previously, there's also in clause 5 leadership the enhanced Focusing on clause 4.1, this requires us to look and identify the relevant internal and external issues facing the organisation. This can easily be done through the use of SWOT and PESTLE analysis. Starting with your strengths, you may have a really good historical safety record. You may also have a very experienced workforce, and senior management may be aware of their responsibilities and accountabilities for health and safety. These are all positive strengths that can be brought to the fore when implementing 45001. However, on the flip side of that, you could also have weaknesses. You may have poor staff engagement, a poor safety culture, a lack of any dedicated health and safety report, or a lack of proactive near-miss reporting. You may find there's opportunities with regards to implementation of a new technology to remove people from the hazards. 45001 also gives us the opportunity to renew interest in health and safety through recommunication and re-engagement with the workforce. Ultimately, you could also be facing threats. Competitor activity might be putting pressure on production. Worst case scenario, you may be failing to comply with the requirements of legislation. Or there may be historical issues like insurance claims that are in the pipeline. So a SWOT analysis helps us to identify useful internal issues. Looking at things from an external perspective, this is where PESTLE analysis can come into its own. Political issues such as bureaucracy, government stability and policy, employment rates, trade restrictions and Brexit are all high-level issues that are currently in the news. Linked to this, there could be economic issues that are affecting the business. Interest rates, taxes, the exchange rate, the employment rate, economic change, fines, and the introduction of fees for intervention could all be issues. Increasingly, there's a social focus on health and safety from an occupational health perspective. This focuses on mental health, occupational health and well-being, career development, education, and developing a positive health and safety culture. Technological issues, as mentioned earlier, could relate to the automating of processes, which removes human beings from the potential dangers there may be. There could be emerging technologies, such as apps, mobile device, and artificial intelligence that could be exploited to the organisation's benefit. Similarly, there's an area where environmental health comes into play, and this is where 14001 requirements and 45001 requirements start to cut across each other. So there could be issues relating to hazardous substances, use of asbestos, dust management, water management, also relevant legal, national or EU legal requirements. Subsequently, your buildings and infrastructure and the increase in extreme weather events could be putting people at risk. Finally, there's requirements around legal elements with employment law, health and safety law, HSE initiatives, approved codes of practice, and possibly even contractual requirements, which could relate to health and safety. So developing a SWOT and PESTLE analysis helps us to address the requirements of 4.1. Moving into 4.2, this requires us to identify our interested parties, what their needs and expectations are, and whether there are any legal or other requirements which those expectations place on us. A very simple way of addressing this is through a table similar to the one on the screen at the moment. So starting down the left-hand side, we identify our interested parties. This list comes from that provided in the Useful Supporting Standard BS 45002. The needs and expectations of those interested parties can then be defined. And then we can identify related legal or other requirements that relate to those expectations. So again, a simple table like this can help us to address the requirements of 4.2. Now we touch on some of the other enhanced requirements. 6.1 requires us to identify actions to address risks and opportunities. The requirement to identify hazards and undertake risk assessments has always been in OHSAS 18001. This is reflected in 6.1.2. And also the requirement to determine legal and other requirements is identified in 6.1.3. However, we can take actions from the SWOT and PESTLE analysis and the needs and expectations of the interested parties that have been identified in clause 4.1 and 4.2. This feeds in, and we also then can plan action to identify and take action on those issues and significant risks and opportunities that have been identified. This leads us into 8.1, operational planning and control. Again, there are enhanced and tighter requirements in this clause than there were previously in OHSAS 18001. Specifically, we need to take action to eliminate hazards and reduce health and safety risks that have been identified. There are also specific requirements around having effective change management procedures and procurement procedures, which also extend to the management of contractors and subcontractors. Coming back to 6.1.3, the requirement to identify legal and other requirements. A very simple way of doing this is through a legal register. This example legal register identifies the type of legislation, the specific legal requirement that's been placed on the organisation, along with a hyperlink back to legislation.gov, which ties in the specific piece of legislation that we're looking at, and also considers how it specifically impacts our organisation. Supporting this, there's a link to guidance and useful information from the HSE website. This can be further extended to include compliance requirements as well. Useful sources of information include the HSE website, as mentioned, legislation.gov, gov.uk, or you may have your own subscription to a pay web. A simple way of capturing this is through a risk register. Again, starting from the left-hand side, we may have identified issues during our SWOT and PESTLE analysis. These can be transferred into a risk register for those that we're going to take action on. We can make a risk treatment decision, decide on an action to be taken, assign that to an individual, and put a target date on for its completion. Finally, we can measure whether we've achieved it or not through the measure of success. So this brings us on to our first success factor required to successfully implement ISO 45001. Our first success factor requirement is top management commitment. Top management must demonstrate leadership, commitment, assign responsibilities, and ultimately be accountable for health and safety in the organisation. Two clauses specifically require this in the standard, and this needs to be demonstrated clearly during audits. Top management also need to be involved in the allocation of necessary resources, i.e. the people, time, money, and information to maintain the health and safety management system. Again, two clauses within the standard specifically relate to this, clause 5.1 and clause 7.1. Top-down management approach is a critical success factor to successfully implementing 45001 and must be demonstrated during audits. Our next success factor relates to communication, consultation, and participation of workers in the health and safety management system. Again, coming back to clause 5.1, top management need to develop, lead, and promote a culture in the organisation that supports the success of the health and safety management system. This comes back to developing a positive health and safety culture and can only be driven from the top down. This naturally leads to the inclusion of workers in being consulted and participating in health and safety related matters. And where this exists, possibly the use of trade union representatives as well. Coupled to this, it relates to the obvious requirement to communicate with each other, and there's a specific clause in 45,001 that relates to communication both on an internal and an external level. I'm now going to spend some time looking at participation consultation. Clause 5.4, as touched on earlier, specifically relates to this area. The clause states that the organisation shall, which means must, provide the necessary mechanisms, time, training and resources necessary for consultation and participation with workers. Top management should also provide timely access to clear, understandable and relevant information about the health and safety management system, and determine and remove obstacles or barriers to participation and minimise those that cannot be removed. This again comes back to culture and can relate to attitude, the potential for intimidation and peer pressure relating to employees. So encouraging a positive culture where employees feel safe to come forward with suggestions and ideas is absolutely critical. The next, workers. Workers need to be involved in determining the needs and expectations of interested parties. They also need to be involved in establishing the health and safety policy and also assigning relevant roles, responsibilities and authorities as applicable. Workers also need to be involved in how they're going to meet the legal requirements that we've identified, and also be involved in setting objectives and actions to achieve them. Workers also need to be involved in the applicable controls for outsourcing procurement and contractors, determining what we need to monitor and measure, and maintaining an audit program, and also for driving continual improvement within the organisation. Finally, employees also need to be involved in the mechanisms for how to consult and participate in the first place. They need to be involved in risk assessment and identifying opportunities, and also the actions to help eliminate the hazards that have been identified during risk assessments. They need to be involved in determining competency requirements, training needs, being involved in training and evaluating the effectiveness of training that's been delivered. They need to be involved in what needs to be communicated and the mechanisms for how this will be achieved, and for defining the necessary control measures, and ultimately investigating incidents and non-conformities with a view to determining effective corrective actions to avoid the reoccurrence of incidents and accidents as they occur. A simple way of defining communications is through a communications plan. This simple table helps to address the requirements of clause 7.4 of the standard. Starting on the left-hand side, we can see from 4.2 the interested party that we've previously identified. We can define what needs to be communicated to our interested parties, when this will be communicated, who we're going to communicate with, the communication method, and who from the organisation will ultimately undertake to communicate. Moving on, our next success factor relates to operational excellence. It's absolutely critical that ISO 45001 should be seen to be integrated with other management system standards and other business processes. Health and safety should be seen as part of business as usual and not a separate function within the organisation. Your health and safety manager should be seen to be a facilitator. Health and safety policies should also be compatible with the overall strategic objectives and direction of the organisation. This means that health and safety should be considered and should be part of your top management discussions within the boardroom. Staying with operational excellence, we need effective processes for identifying hazards, controlling health and safety risks, and taking advantage of health and safety opportunities. This relates to having a really robust and effective risk assessment process, one that provides us with repeatable, consistent results, and one that is suitable and sufficient. Coupled with this, health and safety objectives, which align with the health and safety policy aspirations and take account of the findings from hazards and risk assessments and opportunities, should also be aligned. Our next success factor relates to monitoring, measuring, and evaluation. Organisations need to continually perform, evaluate, and monitor the health and safety management system to see whether we're actually improving or not. A number of suitable metrics should be developed. This should be a mix of leading and lagging indicators. Lagging indicators can include measurement of accidents and incidents, whereas leading indicators may include, for example, a number of leadership tools or inspections undertaken, and the number of trained staff in health and safety management practices. Coupled with this, we need to evaluate compliance with applicable legal requirements and other requirements. This comes back to legal requirements that we identified in 6.1, that extends to ensuring that an evaluation of compliance has taken place against those legal requirements to determine whether we're complying with legal requirements or not. A simple monitoring and measuring plan can help us to achieve the requirements of clause 9.1. Starting from the left-hand side, we need to identify what needs to be monitored and measured. We also need to consider the method for monitoring and the criteria against which we will evaluate health and safety performance, when the monitoring and measuring will be performed, and ultimately when the results of monitoring and measuring activities are analysed, evaluated, and communicated within the organisation. We also need to report on health and safety performance. Those of you who have already got a management system for ISO 9001, 14001, or OHSAS 18001 will be familiar with the requirements of management review. And it's very easy to integrate requirements of ISO 45001 into an existing management review framework. We can see from this list here a suitable agenda that we might adopt for implementing 45001. The items in yellow are the additions specific to 45001. We need to report back on any changes in legal requirements and other requirements. We also need to report on any changes to risks and opportunities within the organisation. We should also be providing information and trends on incidents to determine whether things are getting better or worse, and also provide information on the results of evaluations of compliance with legal and other requirements to confirm to top management, hopefully, that the organisation is compliant. Finally, we can identify and report back on trends from consultation and participation activities with workers. So, we know the success factors required to successfully implement 45001, but we also know that sometimes systems fail, and we need to consider why this happens. This is normally due to a lack of top management interest and ultimate accountability for health and safety. Coupled with this, there can also be a lack of resources, such as people, money, or time required to maintain a management system. This can also relate to a poor safety culture, a lack of communication, a lack of worker involvement, and poor alignment of policies. All of these factors point to a lack of top management commitment to health and safety management systems. Other factors that can influence when systems fail include a poor or ineffective risk management process, one that maybe doesn't give you repeatable, consistent results. The management system may not be integrated into existing processes. There may also be a number of weak or ineffective objectives that aren't considered to be SMART. Decisions could be made on poor information or circumstantial evidence rather than facts and data. Ultimately, there could be a complete failure to comply with legal or other requirements. However, as the slide says, it's not all doom and gloom. In the EU, and specifically in the UK, incident rates for fatalities continue to drop, and the UK consistently has one of the lowest rates of fatal injuries across the EU. So we have an opportunity. ISO 45001 is finally here. It took a long time to get here, but we have an opportunity to build on the best practice approach for managing safety in any organisation anywhere in the world. And UK organisations continue to lead the way in health and safety management practices. So hopefully that provides you with useful hints and tips for implementing ISO 45001 in your organisation. Thanks for listening. Now over to Mel for some questions that we have maybe just received during the presentation.
Great, thank you very much for that informative introduction to 45001. That's great, thanks very much, Paul. Yeah, so we have received some questions. So I'd just like to run these by you, Paul. The first one is, are the certification bodies ready to assess and certify against 45001 now that it's here?
Yes, they certainly are. 45001 was launched in March, and a number of organisations were actually certified on the day of launch. So all of the UCAS accredited certification bodies are generally in a position to be able to audit and assess against the 45001 requirements.
Okay, great. And the next one is from a company that says that they've currently got OHSAS 18001 and they'd like to know how long they have to migrate to the new standard. Okay,
so the standard was launched in March, and there's a 3-year transition period in order for organisations to migrate over to 45001.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question is there any government funding available for businesses to implement the standard?
There are pockets of funding available, certainly something that businesses can access. Some of this is EU funded and can also be locally sourced as well. So it's best to investigate that, or equally it's something that Blackmores can help support with investigating.
Okay, thank you. And finally, the last question is, if the company wants to go for 45001, is that it? Is it valid forever, or is there a period of validity for the certificate?
Okay, so on successful achievement of certification, certificates are valid for 3 years, and during that year cycle there'll be a number of surveillance audits that take place.
Okay, great. Well, that's it for the questions. So yeah, once again, I'd like to thank you for listening to the webinar today. If you do have any other questions to ask, then we're more than happy to assist. We've got our contact details on the screen there, and I believe we've also got an e-learning course on its way on ISO 5001. So that will be available on the website, as well as any other updates as we go through this period of migration to the new ISO standard. So thank you very much for listening.